Section 42 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 3, by Henry Charles LEA. Book 8, Chapter 2, Spheres of Action, Moriscos, Part 4. In the kingdoms of the Crown of Aragon, the position of the Moriscos was different from that in Castile. They were mostly vassals of the nobles, settled on lands of which they held the dominium utile, while their lords owned the dominium directum. For these lands they paid tribute in money, in kind, or in service, and we are told that these imposts amounted to the double of what could be exacted from the Christians. It is easy to appreciate the old proverb, "The more Moors, the more profits," and also that the nobles were vitally interested in protecting their vassals from external interference. Their ability to do this was largely owing to the sturdy independence with which the ancient fueros and privileges were maintained. Alarm was taken early, for in 1495 the Cortes of Tortosa obtained from Ferdinand a fuero that he would never expel or consent to the expulsion of the Moors of Catalonia and, after the occurrences in Castile, the Cortes of Barcelona, in 1503, represented the destruction which it would cause and obtained a repetition of the pledge. At the Cortes of Monzon, in 1510, he renewed this, with the addition that he would make no attempt to convert them by force, nor throw any impediment in the way of their free intercourse with the Christians and, to the observance of this, he took a solemn oath, a repetition of which was exacted of Charles V on his accession in 1518. Under these guarantees both the Moors and their lords might well imagine themselves secure. As we have seen, the jurisdiction of the Inquisition did not extend to the unbaptized so long as they committed no offences against religion. It had little scruple, however, in disregarding its limitations, and in Valencia, as early as 1497, it undertook to prevent the wearing of Moorish costume and sent officials to Ceara to arrest some women for disobedience. They were not recognized and were maltreated, while the women were conveyed away. We have seen how the tribunal arbitrarily avenged itself by arresting all residents of Ceara who chanced to come to Valencia, and that, when appeal was made to Ferdinand, he expressed his displeasure and ordered greater moderation in future. Yet the leaders in the resistance at Ceara were imprisoned for 3 years and suffered confiscation and banishment, leading to considerable correspondence in which Ferdinand sought to mitigate the harshness of the tribunal. He showed the same disposition towards the Moorish aljama of Fraga, which was concerned in the confiscation of a certain Galceran de Abella, and also towards the Moors of Saragossa, when involved in trouble with that tribunal by reason of harboring a female slave who had escaped from Borja. After the enforced conversion of the Castilian Moors, the tribunal of Aragon overstepped its powers by endeavoring, indirectly if not directly, to compel submission to baptism. The Duke and Duchess of Cardona, the Count of Ribagorza, and other magnates complained, in 1508, to Ferdinand, who reprimanded the inquisitors sharply for exceeding their jurisdiction, with much scandal to the Moors and damage to their lords. No one, he said, should be converted or baptized by force, for God is served only when confession is heartfelt, nor should anyone be imprisoned for simply telling others not to turn Christian. In future, no Moor was to be baptized unless he applied for it; any who were imprisoned for counselling against conversion were to be released at once, and the papers were to be sent to the Inquisitor general Enguera for instructions, nor were arrests to be made without his orders. As it was reported that others had fled in fear of forcible conversion or imprisonment, steps must be taken to bring them home with full assurance against violence. In the same spirit, in 1510, when some Moors in Aragon had been converted and had consequently been abandoned by their wives and children, Ferdinand ordered the inquisitors to permit them to return, and not to exert pressure on them or to baptize them forcibly. Ferdinand understood his Aragonese subjects and had learned when to respect their fueros. These incidents indicate that there was a movement on foot which sometimes overstepped the limits of persuasion. There was, in fact, a process of voluntary conversion, affording hope that in time the wished-for unity of faith might be accomplished without coercion. A Catalan alfaqui named Jacob Tellez, was baptized and brought several aljamas to embrace Christianity. When Ferdinand, to aid him, granted him license to travel everywhere and to have entrance into all aljamas, whose members were required to assemble and listen to him. The Moors of Caspe sought baptism in 1499. In the district of Teruel and Albarracin, in 1493, a mosque was converted into the Church of the Trinity, and in 1502 the whole population embraced Christianity. Wholesale conversions such as these were apt to furnish backsliders, and, when the Inquisition undertook to punish those of Teruel and Albarracin, Charles V interposed in 1519. He understood, he said, that many of the children of the conversos, who had lapsed, desired to return to the faith, but were deterred through fear of punishment; wherefore he granted them a term of grace for a year, during which they could come forward and confess without incurring confiscation, and similar concessions were made in Tortosa and other cities. Valencia, which had the largest and densest Moorish population, was also the scene of considerable proselyting and of vigorous inquisitorial action. An influential alfaqui, named Abdallah, was converted, took orders as a priest, under the title of Maestro Mocen Andres, and devoted himself to winning over his brethren. He wrote a work controverting the Koran chapter by chapter, which was printed and circulated. The little town of Manassés must have been converted almost in mass, for we happen to have a sentence uttered in the church there, by the inquisitors of Valencia, April 8, 1519, on 230 Moriscos, then present, who had come in under an edict of grace, confessing and abjuring the errors into which they had relapsed. They were received to reconciliation, apparently without confiscation, and the penances prescribed were purely spiritual, although in addition they were subjected to the customary severe disabilities. There must not have been a little cruel preliminary work for, in the list of these penitents, no less than 32 women were described as the wives or daughters of men who had been burnt. It is easy for us now to recognize how powerful an impediment was this method of preserving the purity of the faith by obstructing the wished-for conversion, for the Mudejares who refused baptism could congratulate themselves that they were not subject to a jurisdiction which visited with such severity the adherents to ancestral habits that had become a second nature. The missionary work thus impeded received an unlooked-for impulse from the insurrection known as the Germania or Brotherhood, which suddenly broke out in 1520. This was a revolt of the people against the oppression of the nobles, which, in its peaceful beginning, won the approval of Charles and of his representative, Cardinal Adrian. It speedily developed into civil war, in which the nobles had the aid of their Moorish vassals. These formed a large portion of the forces with which the Duke of Segorbe won the victories of Oropesa and Almenara, early in July, 1521, and they constituted a third of the infantry under the Viceroy Mendoza in the disastrous rout of Gandia, July 25th. To cripple the nobles, the leaders of the Germania conceived the idea of baptizing by force the Moors, thus giving them the status of Christians and releasing them from vassalage. Urgelles, the chief captain, mortally wounded at the siege of Jativa, which surrendered July 14th, was already busily engaged in compelling the baptism of the Moors in the places under his control, and his successor, Vicente Peris, who won the decisive victory of Gandia, adopted the same policy. Full particulars as to proceedings in the different towns and villages were obtained by a commission, formed in 1524 to ascertain whether the baptisms were voluntary or coerced, and the evidence in its report shows that bands of agermanados traversed the territory between Valencia and Oliva, terrorizing the Moors and offering them the alternative of baptism or death. A few homicides punctuated their commands, and the helpless infidels flocked to the baptismal font for safety. Of course there was no pretense of instruction or of ascertaining what the neophytes knew of the religion thus imposed upon them. They were baptized by sprinkling them in batches and squads, and when holy water was not at hand, that from running streams was employed. The only redeeming feature in the evidence is the frequent allusion to friendly relations between Christians and Moors, and to the refuge and protection willingly given to the terrified victims, showing how the antagonism of race was gradually subsiding, and how its extinction might have been hopefully anticipated if matters had been allowed to develop naturally. Attempts were also made to convert the mosques into churches. In a few places they were consecrated; in some others only a paper picture of Christ or the Virgin was hung up, or attached to the door. Occasionally divine service was performed, which the neophytes attended with more or less regularity, but their adhesion to their new faith lasted only while the impression of terror continued. In some places they felt safe to recur to their old religion in 3 weeks; in others they remained nominally Christian for a few months, but everywhere, as soon as they felt the danger to be past, they resumed their Moslem rites and worshipped in their mosques as before. In this, for the most part, they were encouraged by their lords, who assured them that the coercive baptism was invalid, that they were free to revert to their faith. Others more prudently seized the opportunity to escape to Africa, and it was estimated that no less than 5,000 houses were left vacant, inferring an immigration of some 25,000 souls. The suppression of the Germania in 1522 enabled the Inquisition to commence action against those who had been brought under its jurisdiction by baptism. Inquisitor Churruca of Valencia entertained no scruple as to the validity of the sacrament, but there was difficulty in the fact that the hurried proceedings had precluded the making of records that would identify individuals. When the officiating priests had made lists he demanded their surrender and, toward the close of 1523, he was busy in obtaining evidence from eye witnesses. Some fragmentary documents show that he was partially successful, and that he was prosecuting those whom he could prove to be apostates, but there was no disposition to treat them harshly. It would appear, indeed, that Cardinal Adrian adopted a policy of toleration, which, after his elevation to the papacy, enabled the advocates of the Moriscos to claim that they had the benefit of a dispensation. The situation, in fact, was perplexing. In Castile enforced conversion had been universal, under the threat of expulsion; all were constructively baptized and could legally be held to the consequences. In Valencia, however, the Germania had occupied but a portion of the territory, and even there the work had been partial and so irregularly executed that identification was impossible save in isolated cases. As soon as the pressure was removed, all had reverted to their pristine belief, and the sovereign was under a solemn oath that no compulsion should be employed. The simplest solution that offered was to complete the work and to convert the whole Moorish population, after securing the assent of the nobles by conceding that their rights should not be affected and that converts should not be permitted to change their domicile. Missionaries were therefore sent to try the effect of persuasion; prominent among them was Fray Antonio de Guevara. In a letter of May 22, 1524, he says that for 3 years he had labored at the task, doing nothing but dispute in the aljamas, preach in the morerias and baptize in the houses. Well meant as was this effort, its success was not commensurate with its merits. The question refused to be solved, and the claims of the Inquisition to exercise jurisdiction over the so called apostates inevitably provoked discussion as to the validity of enforced baptism, the degree of coercion by the agermanados, and the sufficiency of the rite so irregularly performed. We have seen above (Vol. I, page 41) that, when the Goths coerced their Jewish subjects to baptism, the Fourth Council of Toledo enunciated the principle that, while the act was wrong, the baptism was indelible and the baptized must be forced to remain in the Church, a principle which became embodied in the canon law. Still there was a question as to the degree of coercion, and Boniface VIII, while assuming to exempt those whose coercion was absolute, took care to define that the fear of death was not such coercion. In the refinement of scholastic theology 2 kinds of coercion were distinguished: conditional or interpretive, and absolute. It was decided that coerced volition is still volition, and absolute coercion was reduced to the proposition that, if a man tied hand and foot were baptized while uttering protests, the rite would be invalid. Such was the received practice of the Church, although a few schoolmen of high repute denied the validity of the sacrament under coercion, rather as an academical question, for the Church assumes consent and compels the so called convert to the observance of the faith imposed on him. It was inevitable that the converts of the Germania were to be held to their responsibilities as Christians. Charles V had already resolved on his policy and had applied to Clement VII to be released from his oath not to impose Christianity on the Moors, but the proceedings of Inquisitor Churruca were exciting murmurs, and a decent show of preliminary investigation was advisable. Charles at first ordered this to be done by the governor of Valencia, in conjunction with the inquisitors and some theologians and jurists, but this was not a sufficiently authoritative body to justify the far-reaching measures in contemplation, and Manrique suggested, January 23, 1524, the formation of a junta under his presidency, in view of the opposition of the nobles and gentry, who dreaded the loss accruing to them from the Christianization of their vassals. That this was merely to save appearances is evident from the fact that when Charles, on February 11th, gave orders for the assembling of the junta, he wrote on the same day to Germaine, vice queen of Valencia, instructing the inquisitors and vicar general to take due action with the apostate Moriscos. 9 days later Manrique issued a commission to Churruca and his assessor Andres Palacio to make a complete investigation into all the circumstances of the conversion and backsliding of the Moriscos, a selection which indicates the foregone conclusion, as they had already committed themselves on all the questions involved. 2 other commissioners, Martin Sanchez and Juan de Bas, were added to them when, in November, they started on their work, and meanwhile the inquisitors had been taking testimony on their own account. The investigation lasted only from November 4th to the 24th, as the commission moved from place to place in the little district between Alcira and Denia. 128 witnesses were interrogated on a series of questions drawn up by Manrique, and their evidence established beyond doubt that the submission to baptism was under the influence of mortal terror. The report of the commission consisted simply of the testimony as taken down by the secretary, but it was supplemented by a learned argument in scholastic form by the fiscal of the tribunal, Fernando Loazes, the future Archbishop of Valencia. In this he made no pretence that the baptism was voluntary. The violence he admitted to be a crime, for which the actors should be punished, but the effect was good and should be maintained. It was the way in which God evokes good out of evil. The Moors had been saved from perdition and from slavery to the demon and, as this was a public benefit, the converts must be compelled to adhere to the Catholic faith, and those who upheld them in apostasy must be prosecuted as fautors and defenders of heresy. All doctors agree that when there is danger of infecting the faith, the prince can compel uniformity or can expel the unbelievers. It was an imposing assemblage to which the report was submitted, consisting of a reunion of the councils of Castile, of Aragon, of the Inquisition, of military orders and of Indies, together with eminent theologians, and it was under the presidency of Manrique. There evidently was not unanimity, for the discussion occupied 22 days, and some of the theologians, with Jaime Benet, the most eminent canonist of Spain at their head, denied the validity of the baptisms. Still the inevitable conclusion was that, as the neophytes had made no resistance or complaint, they must adhere to the faith, willingly or unwillingly. On March 23, 1525, the emperor attended a meeting, in which Manrique announced to him the decision, which he confirmed and ordered measures to be taken for its enforcement. In pursuance of this, a royal cedula on April 4th, after reciting the care bestowed on the question and the unanimous conclusion reached, declared the baptized Moors to be Christians, and ordered their children to be baptized, while churches in which mass had been celebrated were not to be used as mosques. It would be difficult to exaggerate the importance of this action on the fate of the Moriscos, for all that followed was its necessary consequence. Without loss of time an imposing inquisitorial commission was organized, with Gaspar de Avalos, Bishop of Gadou, at its head, and a retinue of councillors and familiars. On May 10th they arrived at Valencia, and on Sunday the 14th the bishop in a sermon ordered the publication of the royal cedula, with an edict granting 30 days within which apostates could return with security for life and property, after which they would forfeit both. It could scarce have been intended to execute this atrocious threat, and no attempt seems to have been made to do so. The apostates were not easily distinguishable among their unbaptized brethren, among whom they constituted perhaps 10%, but the commissioners endeavored to identify them, travelling through the land, making out lists and confirming all whom they could discover, as a preliminary to prosecuting the backsliders. Their numbers suggested moderation, for which papal authority was requisite. It was obtained, for a brief of Clement VII, June 16, 1525, recites that Charles had applied to him for a remedy; the multitude of delinquents called for gentleness and clemency, wherefore they were to be prosecuted with a benignant asperity; those who should return to the light of truth, publicly abjure their errors and swear never to relapse, could be absolved without incurring the customary infamy and disabilities. Threats and promises availed little. The 10 or 15,000 Moriscos who had passed through the hands of the Agermanados did not wait to experience the benignant asperity of the commission, but took refuge in the Sierra de Bernia, and the nobles, so far from attempting to dislodge them, favored them, in hopes that their resistance might lead Charles to abandon his purpose. He had been moved to indignation on hearing that the magistrates of Valencia had begged the commission not to ill treat the alfaquies, as the prosperity of the land depended on the Moors, and he now rebuked the nobles, ordering them to go to their estates and teach their vassals to be good Christians. Preparations at length were made to attack the refugees of Bernia, who had held out from April until August; they surrendered under promise of immunity and were taken to Murla, where they were absolved and kindly treated. Section 43.